What is up, guys? Rick Cacus here. Thank you so much for stopping by, and today we have an absolutely cracked out Trickster build for Outriders. And importantly, this is not like a finalized endgame build in the sense that this build requires absolutely zero legendaries to make work. This is something I've been using since the campaign right into the endgame, and it has functioned amazingly. I've been doing solo endgame missions and getting gold ratings when they're like 5 levels above me. So this is definitely something that you can put on when you're still doing the campaign, get a huge boost in power, and use it right into the end game. And so, let's get started. Now, this is a very DPS focused build, but importantly, it is not a glass cannon build. You are incredibly tanky. This is a DPS tank, in fact, almost leaning more towards a tank because it is very hard to die. And the reason is because our damage is coming from the first skill here, Twisted Rounds. So this is going to fill your current weapons magazine with anomaly infused bullets that increase your firepower by a certain number depending on your level, and the skill lasts until you reload or switch weapons. So the increase in damage you get from Twisted Rounds is absolutely insane, and you're gonna see, like in the background gameplay, when I put Twisted Rounds on, I melt enemies, elite enemies, and even bosses. Heck, it'll do an entire cutscene for a boss, and then I'll melt that guy in a few seconds. It is insane how much damage you get from Twisted Rounds. So, we're pairing that with our next perk here, Venator's Knife. Throw a temporal knife at an enemy. The blade will ricochet between a maximum of 5 enemies within a small radius, dealing a certain amount of damage and marking them. All marked targets will be inflicted by slow, and for 10 seconds, the first damage dealt by you will be doubled. So, this is definitely a skill you unlock later in the skill tree, and if you're still leveling up, you can replace this with Slow Trap for a similar effect. And then lastly, we have the best defensive skill, in my opinion, on the Trickster, which is Borrowed Time. And it says, receive shield and mark your location for a time. Triggering the skill again will bend spacetime and teleport you back to the marked spot. So, how do all these things work together? Well, again, your DPS comes from those Twisted Rounds. You're going to be popping them as much as possible, especially around bosses and elite enemies. Your knives are used to slow those enemies, and if enemies are charging you, it's a great way to deter them so you can line up headshots and line up easy damage with your Twisted Rounds. You need something to slow enemies, especially when it comes to those bosses. Just being able to slow them for a few seconds is going to let you absolutely pump them with damage, and you're going to see that a lot in the background gameplay. Now, Borrowed Time comes into effect because, again, it is one of the best defensive skills, and it makes you an absolute tank when we look at the armor mods you need to use with this build. So, there's 2 Borrowed Time mods I would say are required. The first one is Time Space Protection. You receive a huge amount of armor and a % of resistance bonus while the skill is active. Then the other one is Armor of Eons. Activating the skill increases your armor by 100% for 10 seconds. The combination of these two things make popping your Borrowed Time basically like popping Golem Skin or some incredibly defensive skill, and that's how you're going to use it. If you're being charged with a bunch of enemies, you pop Borrowed Time, or you pop Borrowed Time before getting into an engagement, and it just makes you nigh unkillable. And if you start to encounter any trouble, you just press the skill again and teleport back to where you popped it, likely getting out of a bad situation. But after that, the only other mod I would say is required is the additional mag mod for Twisted Rounds, where it says the skill is effective for 2 magazines before triggering the cooldown. This is beyond helpful because it lets you extend that damage increase which you're gonna need. Like, this build is gonna let you go into much higher world tiers because it makes your weapons do way more damage than they should be doing. But again, once the Twisted Round perk wears off, your DPS does suffer. So lasting for 2 whole magazines makes the world of difference, especially when you're doing some weapon stuff that I'll talk about in a sec. But again, those are the only required mods. There's some other mods that are good for this. For example, reducing the cooldown on borrowed time. There's another one that increases the firepower by 15% when you pop Twisted Rounds. That's a great one. There's one that I'm not using that increases the critical damage by 30%. All of those would be good. But something you'll notice for my armor is that almost all of the armor has the additional mods in that second slot that have to do with increasing armor and resistance, especially like this damage absorber mod here. This is fantastic, and this is really what you want. And the reason being is because, again, your DPS comes from Twisted Rounds, so you can really focus on making yourself more tanky and increasing your survivability without sacrificing DPS. But it also really works with Armor of Aeon. So the more armor you have, when you increase that armor by 100%, that effect is obviously going to stack to the moon, and that is going to make you, again, really, really tanky. Alright, now for our weapon, obviously you want the highest damage possible. I would recommend going with an assault weapon, so like an SMG, a double gun, an assault rifle, something like that, an LMG. And there's some really cheeky perks you can put on, because remember, Twisted Rounds lasts for 1 magazine, right? So if you can extend that magazine by any means, that just means Twisted Rounds is active for way longer. And the best mod for that by far is this one here. Brain Eater. Critical shots do not consume ammo. So you're going to see in the background gameplay, it lets you go right up to those bosses, hit them with the knife so they're not moving, and then just plug them in the head, and you get all of your ammo back. It really, really works well with Twisted Rounds. It means that 1 magazine of Twisted Rounds can last 10 times longer than it's supposed to. But really, any weapon mod that gives you ammo back or extends your magazine in some way is gonna be fantastic. And lastly, let's take a look at the skill tree. So firstly, you're starting in the middle tree, you're going for leap, so when you activate borrowed time, you're going to increase your armor piercing, then you're going for against the odds. This is a really good skill. When you reload, it deals damage, and importantly, it interrupts enemies nearby, so it lets you get out of sticky situations. Then we're going up into the top tree, we're getting Outrider Executioner, so when you activate borrowed time, you increase your weapon damage by 50% for 8 seconds, so you can really stack that with Twisted Rounds to just disintegrate enemies. Then we're going for Disruptive Firepower, so when you activate your knife, it's going to increase your weapon damage as well. Then Sign of Power, so when your damage skills end, it's going to increase your weapon damage, so it means that you're not totally out of the fight when your Twisted Rounds ends. Then we're going over to Bounty Hunter to increase weapon damage against elite enemies, which is kind of where you need the damage. Then increasing your magazine size by 50% obviously goes perfectly with Twisted Rounds. We're increasing Assault Rifle damage because that's where we're using more often. And then we end in Cold Calculation. For each enemy in close range, your weapon damage is increased by 8%. And to my knowledge, this doesn't really have a cap. Guys, I will often let myself get overwhelmed by enemies. I'll not kill the small enemies, and it lets you absolutely melt the bigger enemies in those groups. Like, it is not uncommon to have nearly a 100% damage increase, and then you just use that against the brood mother or the bigger boss when all the other little enemies are nearby, absolutely disintegrate them, and then deal with the smaller enemies after. And because nearly every enemy in this darn game rushes you, this skill is active like constantly. Really, really fantastic one. And so guys, that is it for the build. I hope you enjoyed this video, found it informative, and if you did, please remember to help me out by simply rating and especially sharing this video. If you guys want to see more Outriders content similar to this, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. If you want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickCacus. That's linked in the description down below. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.